I'm Dr. Barry, licensed psychologist, and here I cover legal news from a psychological perspective. We're going to take a step back. I was asked to cover the Jodi Arias case. It's a case from a while ago, but the experts that testified in this case, I wanted to take a look at the defense expert, Dr. Richard Samuels, and then also the prosecution expert, because they had a very different perspective. Some potential questions regarding ethics came up in this case, gifts or resources provided to the client. There were questions about, did Dr. Samuels cross the line from being an expert witness to being a treating clinician? Because there's a very big difference. And so now here's my disclaimer. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am just reviewing this publicly available information. And these are just based on my opinions. I did not do a psychological, or I'm not involved in this case in any way. And so I like to give that disclaimer before we hop right in. For a little overview, Jodi Arias, she was ultimately convicted of murdering her ex-boyfriend. And the details are pretty gruesome. She's been called a sociopath, like people have called her some things. And I really just wanted to take a look at this testimony. So let's hop right in to Dr. Samuels. So this is from day 32 of the trial, and I will put a full link to all the videos that I share down in the description.
Showed on the slide something that an article, it was a review article, I believe.
Yes.
And in that review article, it talked about some of the different things that can cause transient global amnesia.
Yes.
Can you first tell us what's a review article?
That particular article, a review article.
Okay, so he was asked a question about transient global amnesia, and so that's what he's about to talk about now.
Is one on this, which is what I read.
All right, and in that summary article, did it talk about some of the things that can cause transient global amnesia?
Yes.
And on the slide last week, one of the slides talked about things like being immersed in hot water or cold water.
Yes.
Can that really cause transient global amnesia?
Well, apparently it can. These were documented from patient reports and other.
You just have to be careful with articles, because depending on how big the article was, or I don't know, like there's research, you have to be careful when you're taking a look at research. It sounds like they're bringing this into this case, but with amnesia, with a crime, you have to figure out, is the person lying, or do they truly not remember? And to me, in my opinion, some of her actions afterwards would not support an amnesia, like that she did not remember, because she got rid of the weapon. Like, she did all of these things. And so, and I don't know if she knew that when she left the camera that they were going to be able to have like timestamps for certain things. I don't know if she fully realized all of that.
Examinations of cases that appeared in the archives of people who study these things.
All right. So what's the point of talking about transient global amnesia?
Well, I wanted to point out to the jury that amnesia is not necessarily a fake or made up kind of experience. It occurs fairly commonly in the population, 3 to 8%, or 3 to 8% of every 100,000 cases. So 3 to 8% of every 100,000 cases. It's a small percentage, but the fact of the matter is that it's regularly reported. And so it is not as if amnesia can only be made up as to cover up something.
And now, is this transient global amnesia, what we're talking about right now, that can be caused by some, would you characterize them as minor type?
Relatively minor.
And these relatively minor type actions like immersion in hot water or cold water, is the basis for the amnesia is because it's a shock?
Probably so.
Okay.
The etiology is not completely understood.
All right. And when I say shock, I'm saying like shock to the system, the person.
Yes, a shock to the system.
Okay. Is that something that Jodi suffers from?
No.
And what is it that you would say that Jodi, what type of amnesia does she have?
The type of amnesia that she...
Rule 703, 702, ultimate issue.
Just may we approach?
You may.
All right, Dr. Samuels, before we get to talking so much about Jodi, let's talk a little bit more about dissociative amnesia. Can you tell us what it is?
Dissociative amnesia is a form of amnesia. There are several different types.
Okay, so dissociative amnesia, that came up with Letitia Stout as well. And in my opinion, I did not feel that she was suffering from dissociation or from a dissociative state. And they're not claiming dissociative identity disorder. They're just claiming an episode of dissociative amnesia.
Types of amnesia, but this is a form of amnesia that appears to be based upon the fact that memories were not initially established due to an interference with the hippocampus. And it usually has a specific beginning and a specific end or period of time when memories are not being formed. And the individual cannot retrieve memories for that period of time.
Judge may approach.
Yes.
Gonna fast forward.
The brain that we used last week?
Yes.
Slide?
Yes.
All right. And does this help?
Okay, so they're gonna go into like pictures of the brain and memory and all of that. I'm gonna fast forward through that part. So basically, he's gonna say that he thinks she has dissociative amnesia.
Say more complete. What do you mean?
The loss is greater. The loss is more permanent. Most of what's occurred is not remembered, as opposed to perhaps some of it being remembered.
All right. Now, last week you said that you had met with Miss Arias several times. Is that
Yes.
right? About how many times did you meet with her?
I think we met about 12 times.
And do you have an idea about how many hours you spent with her?
Probably between 25 and 30 hours all told. But that did not include the time that I took to test her. I didn't add that time in.
Oh, okay. So 25 or 30 hours of
Yes.
just speaking with her.
Speaking with her.
And then additional time when you did the
That is a lot of just talking. That is a lot. And so I believe the whole evaluation was somewhere around 40 hours. And even for a forensic evaluation, that seems like a lot to me.
the testing.
That's right.
During that time, did you discuss, did she talk to you about what happened and what she could remember?
Yes. Well, the first few times I met with her, as I mentioned, Thursday. This was Thursday?
Thursday.
Thursday, okay. She did not reveal what actually happened. She was telling this story about intruders. I think that's...
His characterization of what really happened. He's now vouching. He can tell us what she told him, but
Sustained.
Go ahead. You can continue.
Okay. So that was the story that she was telling me. And at some point, Mr. Nurmi and I went to visit her, and we encouraged her to reveal the truth. And finally...
I don't object to his characterization. It's a change in story. He can't say it's the truth.
Sustained.
Okay, I understand it.
We're
I
talking
understand.
about
She,
what?
she changed the story and admitted to us that she had done the killing.
Okay. And then after that point in time, did you discuss with her what had happened and the points that she remembered?
Yes.
And did you discuss with her the points, the gap in time that she did not remember?
She remembered, and this was fairly consistent in the numerous times that I asked her this, because part of the examination process is to bring up the same area in several different ways. So it seemed pretty consistent to me that she remembered the point when she dropped the camera. Mr. Alexander, according to her story...
Again, I would object. He's saying it was consistent. And again, he's vouching. He can tell what the stories are. He just can't tell us.
Sustained.
May I, Judge? With regard to the...
Approach, please. You may continue.
Okay. Dr. Samuels, you talked about the consistency. So when you're talking about that, that has to do with what she remembers? In other words, when she's talking to you on different occasions, is she reporting to you that she's remembering the same things?
Yes.
Okay. So is she consistent in that manner to you?
Yes.
And the gaps that she does not remember, are those gaps, have they been consistent with you?
Yes.
And where her memory picks up again, has her memories with regard to where it picks up again, has that been consistent?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So when you're speaking with Miss Arias about these things, does it ultimately lead you to a conclusion about what the type of amnesia she might have?
Yes.
And what is that?
It appears as if she suffers from dissociative amnesia.
All right. And that's what we were just talking about here, right? With the memory function and the time.
That's correct. This area here is the period of dissociation.
Okay.
And I might point out
Yes.
that the beginnings, such as here, and the ends tend to be foggy and hazy. And that's classically how it goes, because as the memory function is either gradually deteriorating or gradually being restored, memory.
Or is the person just not telling you the most gruesome part of the story? Like, I don't know. This is hard.
Can begin to occur, but oftentimes they're reported as being foggy or fuzzy.
Okay. And so the foggy or hazy memory is occurring as the brain is going into the complete loss.
Yes.
And as the brain's climbing out of the complete loss, it's also foggy and hazy?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And with dissociative amnesia, are there ever a chance of pieces of memory coming?
Sometimes bits and pieces.
Overruled.
Sometimes bits and pieces of memory can be retrieved. I have done a good deal of hypnosis work looking for restored memories with police departments of officers who were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. It is generally not too effective. Very rarely, some piece of detail will be recalled, but it's rarely productive.
All right. And is that ultimately, I'm showing you exhibit number 529, is that ultimately because there is no memories stored in the gray matter from the traumatic event?
That's correct. The memory has never been encoded into a form that the brain can store long term.
Okay.
And once gone, it's gone.
Okay. Now, we talked, one of the criteria for post-traumatic stress was intrusive thoughts.
Yes.
Is that right? And intrusive thoughts are what?
These are thoughts usually about the trauma that pop up into the actors or the individual understudies thinking. They can't control it. They come in sort of random times. Sometimes it may be at night, sometimes in the morning. Sometimes they may hear something that triggers an intrusive thought, but those are what we call intrusive thoughts.
All right. And did Miss Arias suffer from intrusive thoughts?
Yes.
Well, let me ask you, how can that be if she doesn't remember a big gap of what happened?
The intrusive thoughts that were referred to me, that were mentioned to me, involve the beginning of this traumatic event. She recalled herself being chased.
Check on the grounds of vouching.
She reported remembering that he was threatening her life. And then at the end.
And these are all her allegations. This is really, okay.
All right, I wanted to talk to you about PTSD and its effects on the effects that it has on people. Okay. First, I want to ask, does everybody who experiences a trauma, like something that puts them into acute stress, so a severe trauma, does everyone who experiences a severe trauma often then lead to PTSD?
No.
Okay. How does that work?
Well, typically, maybe I shouldn't use the word typically, but one of the characteristics of a post-traumatic stress disorder is that people who are so diagnosed share a common set of symptoms. The symptoms are listed in the DSM. And one of the characteristics that remains consistent is the fact that they have undergone an atypical stressor. In other words,
I'm sorry, you said atypical?
Atypical.
Okay.
Atypical, meaning not typical.
Okay.
Meaning that it's a stressor out of the realm of normal experience. So it's less likely to develop if a person has a mild automobile accident. It's more likely to occur if they're involved in a killing situation. Not everyone who suffers from an acute stress disorder or from even milder forms of stress will develop PTSD. And the criteria are very specific. But if you've been diagnosed with PTSD, then there are a series of repetitive, consistent stimuli that is shared by a group of those that receive that diagnosis. And not everyone who's diagnosed with PTSD shares the exact same symptoms either, because
So that's all accurate. I am going to fast forward to where they're talking about the methods that he used. And I think I have another video that talks about some of the one past ethical complaint that came up.
But like you said, that was not your goal. You were doing evaluation.
I was doing only evaluation.
Okay. All right. So when somebody is diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, how does it have an effect on their ability to express emotions?
It can, because one of the characteristics, one of the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder is blunted affect.
What is a blunted affect?
Blunted affect means a constriction in their ability to show and express emotion. So we will see an emotive state that doesn't seem to jive with what they're talking about. There's a disconnect sometimes between the emotion connected to the statement and the statement.
And do we know why that happens?
It may have to do with emotional constriction. Right now, I'm venturing into the psychotherapeutic jargon. I can't tell you what structure in the brain is responsible for that, but we know that it's not atypical. It happens when the person suffers from this particular disorder. There's a restricted range of affect. We see that happen. A feeling of detachment, a disconnection, sometimes to relationships, sometimes to situations.
Do they have that detachment when they're talking about the situation that caused the trauma that can be responsible for the PTSD?
Sometimes it's so horrific that you can't deal with it openly. You have to skirt the issue. You have to cushion yourself, because once you start talking about what you experienced, it can break you down. And it's almost like a re-experiencing of the actual trauma. So yes, that's quite common in this type of disorder.
What about if the person is under stress at the time that they're discussing, that they're talking? Does additional stress, can that affect somebody who's been diagnosed with PTSD?
Well, it can. It depends upon the topic that's being discussed as well. But we know, for example, that it can be very difficult for a soldier to talk about a particularly bad experience that they've had.
I'm going to fast forward again a little bit. So he conducted his evaluation over 12 sessions, and it was a lot of hours. And yeah, we're going to keep going.
And part of the therapy,
Like a foundation.
Her
ability rather, it in that person, although it's not caused by that necessarily, it's caused by the fact.
531. How is that different from the big red book you had on Thursday?
This is just a portable angry at her. She noticed that she began to shake.
Assuming it happened once in a while, is this something that to interviews, is that correct?
Yes.
And you looked at the crime scene photos, and is that a yes?
Yes, that's a yes. Sorry.
I saw you shake. Okay. And when you say interviews with a detective, do you mean you read interviews?
No, there was a video recording. Having some anxiety is probably healthy, because you begin to learn how to tolerate it, accept it, overcome it. So experiencing anxiety is actually helpful in some respects for making a person more confident in their life.
So I guess just as long as it doesn't interrupt your life.
That's basically the difference. Yes, that's basically it.
Okay. All right, I want to talk to you about the crime scene. Okay? So these are, well, basically, what do you know? What you know of what happened on June 4th is based on what?
It's based upon the crime scene photographs that I was shown, police reports, interviews with at least one detective, and what later on I was told by Miss Arias, to the degree that she was able to remember.
Okay.
And I also want to point out that when he first started his evaluation, she was saying that there was two intruders, or like there was a lie. She was not initially admitting that it was her. And in my mind, if that's how the evaluation started, then some of the information that I received before the person admitted that, yes, they were the one that did the crime, that could impact the results, because you're looking for things like malingering, or you're looking to see if the person is feigning symptoms, if they're faking symptoms to attempt to get away with a crime.
Okay. And when you say interviews with a detective, do you mean you read interviews?
No, there was a video.
Going to fast forward again a little bit.
What I want to talk to you about, we talked about what you've looked at in terms of the police reports and listened to interviews. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you looked at the crime scene photos. And is that a yes?
Yes, that's yes. Sorry.
I saw you shaking your head. And you also, did you also speak with Miss Arias?
I did.
Okay, and based on all this information, is there something about the crime scene that tells you more about or supports your diagnosis for PTSD and the likelihood of acute stress?
Well, certainly PTSD was not diagnosed until after the event, but there is some indication that she was in a state of acute stress.
Okay, so that's what I want to talk about. The indications that she was in a state of acute stress.
Yes.
Okay.
And based on the prosecution, they are going to say that that acute stress was feeling rejected and abandoned by the ex-boyfriend and being upset that he was moving on. Like, that's what the prosecution is going to say. Okay, we're going to keep going.
Okay. So what is it, based on your review of things, what is it that indicated that she would be in a state of acute stress?
Well, there was a certain irrationality to the...
State of mind, irrationality.
Sustained.
Let me ask you specifically. I think I know where you were going. Is there, we know that...
That's what counsel's statements are, where he was going.
Okay. Are you aware that whether or not a gun was found at the scene?
No gun was found at the scene.
Okay. And are you aware that Miss Arias has a vague memory of getting rid of it?
Yes.
Okay. And are you aware that the camera was found at the scene?
Yes.
And are you aware that Miss Arias is a photographer?
Yes.
Are you aware that when the camera was found, it was found in a washer?
Yes.
And are you aware that as part of the camera, the SD card was still inside?
Yes, I was aware of that.
And are you aware that the SD card was not trampled on or ruined in any way?
Yes.
Are you aware that Miss Arias took the rope that was used to tie her up earlier in the day?
Yes.
And ultimately left the camera?
Yes.
What about in the crime scene photos, based on the blood in different areas of the bathroom and in the hallway, what does that tell you about a struggle occurring?
Rejection, lack of foundation. He's not a blood spatter.
And also, like, as a psychologist, I don't know how he would know, because he's not like a crime scene investigator, or that's just an interesting question for a psychologist, in my opinion.
Expert and state of mind. So with a struggle that happened, he doesn't know.
Sustained is phrased.
The fact that there's blood in more than one area, does that mean that to you that there was movement in the bathroom?
Objection. He's not an expert in blood spatter, indicating how the blood got there.
Judge, you don't need to be an expert to know if blood's in different areas the person moved.
Counsel approach, please.
Yeah, because he's a psychologist. So I want to get to the cross-examination. Let me go ahead and switch to that part. I am recording this in parts, so if my outfit changes, that's why. All right, so now the defense is going to bring up the fact that he has a history of an ethical violation, and let's listen to that part.
Okay, Dr. Samuels, in generally speaking, with in your area with regard to custody situations, is that something that that has issues with it with regard to getting complaints? Doctors, you or other doctors in that area?
Well, sure, there's always one winner and one loser in custody evaluations. So invariably, you're only satisfying 50% of your clientele. And so those types of complaints are not at all
To me, Jodi was looking maybe over at the jury and just kind of seeing how this is going over. That's just what I'm noticing.
uncommon.
And did you ever have a complaint against you?
I did.
Could you tell us when that was?
Yes, it involved a 1994 1995 custody evaluation that I was asked to conduct. It was an extraordinarily acrimonious divorce. There were multiple lawsuits between partners, attorneys, psychologists, psychiatrists. It was a big mess.
What was your role in it?
My role initially was to be the joint custody evaluator. The gentleman came to see me, and I tested him and evaluated him, saw him with his children and so on, but the mother refused to attend.
I do believe that he's able to speak on this because anytime there is an allegation, that some details about the allegation are public. Like if someone's ever had an ethical violation, you can go and search it on whatever the health website is. In Virginia, it's the Virginia Board of Psychology or the Virginia Board of Counseling or Social Work. In other states, it might be a different board.
His attorney asked me instead to provide a letter to her office indicating whether or not I viewed him as a competent parent. I did, but it was not a full-fledged custody evaluation because I never evaluated the woman.
Okay.
I was then told that this was no longer a case of custody and that the only issue was visitation. About 4 weeks later, the wife calls my office and asks to make an appointment. I call the attorney of this gentleman and tell him that she's finally come in. She asks me to please test her, but that the evidence and information would not be used in a custody determination because I was no longer doing custody.
Okay. And this doesn't come up for this, but I would not have done, if I had evaluated the father and now the wife is coming and wants me to evaluate her, but not use it in the future for anything, I would refer to another psychologist because things could get messy if things went back to court. Because he is going to test her, I think he's about to talk about it. If something did come up in court, he could be asked, if the other side knew that he did this, like he could be asked information about it. And so, and that's not even the ethical thing, but that's just my thought.
I explained that to the woman who decided to come in with her children, and I observed her. And I made the observation that she too was a competent parent, no contraindications to either one of them parenting the children.
Did you ultimately testify in that case?
I did not testify as a custody person. I did not testify as a custody evaluator. The gentleman then called me up in tears, begging me to see him as a patient.
Now, just because someone's calling you in tears and begging you to see them does not mean ethically that you should. Because if I evaluated the father and I evaluated the mother, turning it into a treatment relationship that could cause an issue down the road, it could potentially. Like you just have to think down the road. This could be crossing into a different boundary. But those are just my thoughts.
Because he was having terrible troubles. His business went bankrupt. His wife, of course, they had split. He was having tremendous financial problems. He was a dentist. And he asked me to see him for therapy.
Now, are you allowed to do that when you're a custody evaluator?
Well, I formally contacted his attorney and I resigned as custody evaluator.
Just because you resign doesn't mean that you should take the client on as a client. And these are just my thoughts. I'm just sharing my thoughts. And every person does this different. I try to err on the side of caution and I try to be careful in these situations. That's where I say, if I'm doing a general psychological evaluation of the child, and if there's court involvement, I don't start a therapeutic relationship with the parent, or I don't evaluate the parent, just to try to stay neutral in the situation. But we're going to keep going.
And I stated that I would not testify as a custody evaluator. And since custody was no longer the issue, I felt appropriate with that. And of course, I obtained letters from the attorney releasing me from that role and so on. So I started seeing this gentleman. And at some point, he owed me a good deal of money. And he told me that he was going bankrupt. He had no money. And he offered, because he wanted to continue seeing me, for me to see him. And I had looked in the American Psychological Association ethical guidelines.
So to clarify, the patient is a dentist, and the patient offered dental services to make up for the bill, for the therapy bill, where they could barter.
And it said that bartering was permitted as long as it did not, what was the terminology? Did not compromise the relationship. So professional to professional was perfectly fine, which is what we did.
Okay.
And it also just has to be equal. So like the services, neither party can increase the price of the services. The cost has to be equal.
Okay.
And somewhere down the line, I went to court to testify only as to his mental state, because he was now a patient, and that the condition.
And that's where that is messy. That's why I personally, if I had evaluated the wife as well, and now I'm starting a therapeutic relationship with the father, because you never know down the road if you're going to need to testify again. And so I personally would have referred him to another therapist, unless I'm literally the only psychologist in this area.
He was suffering from, which was an anxiety disorder and some depression, would not impede his ability to spend visitation time with his children.
All right. And so at the point that you're testifying down the line, you weren't supposed to be for the husband and the wife.
That's
together.
right. At this point, I was simply I testified as a therapist.
Okay.
And there are other complications, but I won't go into it. At any rate, about a year later, a complaint was filed to the New Jersey Board of Psychological Examiners, and they brought up this case, and part of the case involved the fact that I bartered. Now, unbeknownst to me, New Jersey passed a ruling that did not permit bartering as part of the psychological guidelines. There was a 3-month overlap between the time that I started bartering with him, which was permitted nationally, but not permitted by the state. So
the more important thing is to check your state board, because the state board says what psychologists can do in their state. The American Psychological Association, they just passed general guidelines, and really even filing an ethical complaint with the APA, because so they don't issue licenses, and the American Psychological Association, they can't revoke someone's license. So if you file a complaint with APA, all they could do is maybe revoke someone's membership within APA, but they can't do anything about their license, because the American Psychological Association, it's a professional organization. They don't issue licenses. Now, if the person has, like, if they're on certain boards, or if they have certain credentials with APA, it might impact their status, but it doesn't impact their license, because licenses are provided by the state. This is going to become an issue because the prosecution has some issues with things that came up with Jodi, and they're going to get into that. I'm going to let this go just a little bit more so he can explain, and then I'm going to show the cross-examination.
Let me just get that straight. So in the beginning, when you were going to him as a dentist,
right,
that was okay.
That was okay.
But there was 3 months that you were continuing to see him as a dentist, and that New Jersey had changed the
New
rules.
Jersey had changed the ruling, and I was not made aware. I didn't know that. They may have sent out a bulletin. There was no internet in those days, so they may have sent out a bulletin. I may have missed it. I wasn't unaware of it. At any rate, the wife and her attorney boyfriend found some records that we had done this exchange and decided to file a complaint that I was bartering inappropriately. The New Jersey board examined this material and decided to fine me $2,500 for having done that. And no license was taken away, nothing was suspended, just the fine. The next step was that in psychology and in the field of medicine, if someone makes a complaint to one board, every board that you're on is notified. So they can do their own independent examinations. Letter went out to the American Psychological Association, in which I am the fellow of 2 divisions, and they decided not to take it up. It was trivial. The American Board of Professional Psychology, where I'm a diplomate, decided not to take it up. The Arizona board, 2 years later, decided to take it up, and I was exonerated in a vote of 13-0, and the complaint was dismissed. And that was the one and only time in dealing with thousands of patients, at least over 1,000 evaluations, that anyone ever lodged a complaint. And as I said, both the attorney and the psychiatrist involved in the case were also complained about by this particular party.
So you weren't the only one who got a complaint from this lady?
No, it was a messy case.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And so is that what you mean by do you do custody evaluations?
No,
anymore?
after that, I decided not to do custody evaluations anymore. It just didn't pay.
Okay. All right.
All right, so I am going to move ahead to the cross examination. I think the sound is going to be a little off. I will try to correct that in post, but there might only be so much I can do. So I will try to not interrupt this part as much so it can play, and then because I think the sound goes up a little bit later.
Mr. Martinez, you may continue with cross-examination.
Sir, isn't it true that on a separate occasion, you actually provided the defendant with a gift?
No.
Well, sir, do you remember providing her with a book called Erroneous Zones?
Yes.
And that was something that you provided to her, right?
It was mailed to her, yes.
Which means you provided it to her, correct?
Yes.
And you provided it to her because at that point you believed that she was depressed, right?
No.
Well, let's take a look at what your testimony was. See if this refreshes your memory.
Yes, that is what I said, but actually that book is not.
Sir, that was the question. Isn't it true that you said that the reason you provided it to her was because she was depressed?
I said this here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
You're conducting an evaluation at this point, correct?
Yes.
And providing an evaluation, as part of providing this evaluation, you're also providing a self-help book, right?
Yes.
And this self-help book talks about positive and practical advice for breaking free from the trap of negative thinking and enjoying life to the fullest, right?
Yes, that was for his low self-esteem.
Right. And this is by somebody named Dr. Wayne, or written by somebody named Dr. Wayne W. Dyer, correct?
Yes.
It also talks about if you're plagued by guilt or worry and find yourself unwittingly falling into the same old destructive patterns, then Erroneous Zones is the book for you, right?
Yes.
How is providing a self-help book really doesn't come under the auspices or under the coverage, if you will, of an evaluation, does it?
Not necessarily.
Well, no, not necessarily means it doesn't, right?
No.
And but you were there to try to assess her or evaluate her as it pertained to this particular case, right?
Yes.
And you would agree that if you were there to do that, and now you're trying to help her, there seems to be a little bit of the blurring of the lines there, don't you agree?
No, I don't.
Well, on the one hand, you want to help her, don't you? By giving her that self-help book, yes or no?
Yes, it wouldn't be bad. Yes, I helped her.
And on the other hand, you're to provide an impartial evaluation in this case, right? That's what the code says, right?
I didn't read the book to her. I sent her the book.
But you were the one that actually provided it to her so that she could read it, right?
Yes, she was unable to get it on her own.
I'm not asking you whether or not she could get it on her own. The fact that she couldn't get it on her own, that made you upset enough to go out and buy it for her, right?
No, it didn't make me upset. I did what I did for many people and recommended
Well, I'm
a
not
book.
asking about many people. I'm asking about this particular case because you said that she couldn't get it. You went out of your way to get it and then send it to her, right?
Correct.
That required you to go buy the book, right?
Yes.
That required you to put it in whatever container there was and mail it to her, right?
No, I ordered it online.
You ordered it online. Once you received it, it went to her, correct?
It was sent directly to her through Amazon.
And when you ordered it online, that's money coming out of your pocket, right?
Yes.
So now not only are you sending her something, you're in a sense giving her money, aren't you?
Didn't look at it that way. I gave her a book.
Well, you're not looking at it that way, but that's what happened. You gave her money, and you gave her a book that cost you money, right?
Yes.
How much did that book cost you?
$9.
So here you are buying her a gift that's $9, right?
No, it was not a gift.
Oh, did she give it back to you?
She offered it back to me.
No, I'm not asking you if she offered it back to you. She never gave it back to you, right?
I didn't ask for it back.
Did I ask you whether or not you asked for it back?
So what are you asking?
I'm asking you whether or not isn't it true that she never gave it back to you, right?
She offered it back to me.
I'm not asking you whether or not she offered it to you. You understand that's not my question. You understand that, right?
Yes.
My question is, isn't it true that the book was never returned to you?
Correct.
And so you did this because you believed, or for whatever reason, you started to like her, right?
No,
Oh, so you dislike her.
I didn't say that either.
So you do like her then?
I can't answer that question, true, yes or no.
Well, why not? You spent how many? You went to see her on 12 separate occasions, right?
Depends what you mean by like.
I'm asking you, isn't it true that you went to see her on 12 separate occasions,
As
right?
part of my role to evaluate her, yes.
Yes or no? You did go see her on 12 separate occasions, correct?
Yes.
And you spent many hours with her, right?
Yes.
And you talked about a variety of things, right?
Yes.
You spoke about her relationship, right? With Mr. Alexander?
Yes.
Right? You spoke about previous relationships, right?
Yes.
And you spoke about some sexual issues that were involved with her and Mr. Alexander, correct?
Yes.
You spoke about a lot of things during those 12 visits, right?
Right.
How many hours did you spend with her?
Between 25 and 30 hours.
And during that time, you're saying that it was just a mere passage of time. It wasn't because you liked her that you decided to get that book for her.
Typically, when
Yes or
I
no?
have,
Is that why you decided to get her the book?
could you,
Okay, so they are going to go back and forth on this book issue for quite a while. And basically, what it boils down to is that the evaluator felt that she was having thoughts of harming herself, of unaliving herself, and they wanted to provide her with a resource. And at no time did the evaluator notify the jail staff that she was having those types of thoughts. So I've done evaluations within jail settings. Really, it was juvenile detention settings. And if I'm working with someone, and if during my evaluation, if I become concerned about their safety towards self or others, because I was working with juveniles, individuals under the age of 18, I would notify the parents, but I would also notify the jail staff as well. I would make sure if there was someone that was over clinical, because I want to make sure I don't just want to tell like a guard, like I want to make sure that I'm talking with somebody that's going to make sure to get them the mental health support that they need. And those types of staff exist in every jail setting because that's why they have mental health units. I think almost every jail has a mental health unit for individuals that are having thoughts, or are a risk to themselves or others in that way. Like it's more of a mental health thing and not, something else. And so, oh, like I said, they went back and forth on that for quite a bit. And in my opinion, based on what I heard, I have never given a therapy client or like I've let people borrow resources and I'll be honest, sometimes I haven't gotten them back. But if I'm doing a forensic evaluation, I would never provide them with a resource. And the rebuttal psychologist is going to talk a little bit more about that. And we'll definitely take a listen to that part. I'm gonna fast forward some. Now, the sound on this next section is better, just in case you've adjusted your sound. Like the sound on this next part is going to go back up.
Really was no big deal.
No, what I said was that relative to Arizona, they reviewed the entire case and I was exonerated by a vote of 13-0.
So you were exonerated by Arizona, which indicates that, from your point of view, that you did nothing wrong in New Jersey, right?
No,
And in fact, didn't you sign an agreement with the state of New Jersey agreeing to desist and ceasing from crossing boundaries with clients and entering into relationships which may create conflict of interest with the client?
and that
Really, right now, the prosecution is trying to attack this witness's credibility. Like that's what's happening.
had to do with the bartering issue.
Yes or no? Did you enter into that agreement?
Yes,
And that's the same kind of conduct that we have here, because now you've crossed a boundary involving the defendant, haven't you?
no, I have not.
So during this whole time that and with regard to this issue involving what happened in New Jersey, you indicated that you paid a fine, right?
Yes,
It was $2,500, right?
yes,
In addition to paying the fine of $2,500, you said that was all that was involved. There was more that was involved to this, wasn't there?
I had to read a book.
Pardon?
I had to read a book.
Well, isn't it true that you had to successfully complete continuing education concerning ethics and boundary issues?
Yes,
And it indicated further that these courses should be completed within 6 months of the entry of the consent order. Isn't that what you had to do?
which was resolved by reading a book and taking the test.
And this continuing education could occur either in New Jersey or Arizona, correct?
Correct.
An evaluation such as the one that you conducted is actually a sort of a two-pronged approach, isn't it?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, you do what is called an interview, a clinical interview, right? That's
Yes.
correct. That's one big area, correct?
Yes.
That was part of visiting her in wherever she was and talking to her, right?
Yes.
And this is the one where you previously testified that you would sit there and you would try to take notes as quickly and as accurately as you could, right?
Yes.
You don't tape record, right?
Never. No.
You would agree, though, that tape recording is probably more accurate, correct?
Probably more accurate.
And
And I think in some forensic evaluations, they now require that it be recorded because that's how we got to see exactly what Dr. Lewis did with the Letitia Stout trial. I think it just helps protect things on every side to be able to just show the interview, to show what was said, what was observed. There are certain portions that they can't show because there may be some confidential, so like there's some test security, so like they can't talk about specific test items or different things like that, but normally for those interviews, in most cases those are now recorded.
in addition to that approach, there's something else that you do, and that is you administer tests, right?
Yes.
And one of the tests that you administered was this PSD, right?
Yes.
What does PSD stand for?
Well, it refers to
No, without referring, can you
Yeah.
just, to any materials?
it
can you-
refers to the post-traumatic stress inventory.
Is that the exact name of that test, or is that something that you
No,
use?
it's
Why don't you go, hold on.
post-traumatic.
The PSI is different. The post-traumatic stress inventory, that's different. He gave a different test.
Stress
Sir,
inventory, PDI.
All right, you looked at something when you gave us the name. So what is it that you're looking at to give us that name?
The manual
All
that has
right.
the exact name,
Okay, what-
post-traumatic stress scale, diagnostic scale. That's what it is.
How many times have you administered that test?
Probably 15 times.
And what you said to us was that you actually scored that test yourself, right?
Yes.
And what's going to come out is that he didn't have the record form to give this test when he was there. So he wrote it on a notepad and then he transcribed everything onto the record form. And the prosecution is definitely going to have a big issue with that. And then also, he gave this PSDI or PDI, he gave this post traumatic diagnostic scale, maybe PDS, I don't know. He gave this test while she was still saying that she wasn't the one that did the crime. And so, in my opinion, any results that I received back when the person wasn't being forthright, I don't know how accurate that can be because she was trying to portray herself as the victim. And ugh, ugh. I'm going to skip ahead because people did want me to show a little bit more of his testimony. It's not, to me, it's not as bad as Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis was, oh, that was hard. That was really, really hard. Uh, that was really hard.
Two, right?
Yes.
And it is asking the individual who's taking this test, in this case, the defendant, a question, right?
Yes.
And this is one of the guiding questions that determines or substantiates or confirms or helps you confirm the presence of PTSD, right?
Yes.
And in fact, the way you indicated were that in your report were that her scores on the post-traumatic stress disorder scale confirm the presence of PTSD, right?
Yes.
It says here, if you mark yes for more than one traumatic event in part one, indicate which one bothers you the most. If you marked yes for only one traumatic event in part one, mark the same one on the answer sheet, right?
Yes.
And she's asked about the same 12 questions that we've just gone over, right?
Yes.
That's on
And the one that
the recording.
she indicated was the traumatic event in her life that triggers this post-traumatic stress disorder is what? Why don't you read number 4?
Non-sexual assault, stranger.
Not somebody that she knows, right?
Correct.
You said that you reviewed the photographs of the crime scene, right?
Yes.
And you talked about Mr. Alexander being in that shower, right?
Yes.
He's not a stranger, is he?
No.
He's somebody that she knew, right?
Yes.
And it's talking about that the thing that triggers it for her, this PTSD, is non-sexual assault by a stranger, correct?
Correct.
And the rest of the questions that you have here in Exhibit 534, all of the answers here are based on the fact that she had an assault by a stranger, right?
That's what she said in that test.
Well, no, let's go back to this just so we make sure. 533. It says, why don't you read it for me?
Below,
Make sure that I can bring it in, the whole thing. Okay?
below are several questions about the traumatic event you marked in item 14, non-sexual assault, stranger.
And these are the questions that I have in my right hand, right? These are the answers, right?
Yes,
This is her worksheet, right?
that's right.
Did you turn this worksheet, a copy of this worksheet over to Janine DeMarte?
Yes.
And this is a true and accurate, or this is the actual item that the defendant filled out, right?
Yes.
Take a look at it. 535.
Yes.
I move for the omission to 535.
You may. 535 is admitted.
Fast forward.
No, I did.
And
Judge,
Yes.
so with regard to exhibit 534, this contains the answers to it, right?
Yes.
For example, 534, you said this is the one that the defendant filled out, right?
No, I don't remember.
Well, sir, let me do it this way.
Okay,
Isn't it true that previously you told us that this is the one that the defendant filled out, right?
I believe so.
And isn't it true that you said that whatever mark
My face is doing this because he should know. Like that's hard. And I could imagine there might have been some time that passed, but like he should know, in my opinion. Well, from what I think.
Markings are on here are those of the defendant, right?
Well, those are in my hand.
Okay, so
at least part of it is.
So for example, part 2, where it says circle numbers that apply, that's your writing circle numbers that apply, right?
Yes, that's my writing.
And under 14, it does circle number 4, right?
Yes.
Did you circle that or did she circle that?
I honestly don't recall, but I think she circled it, or she gave me the number and I circled it. I don't recall.
And then down at the bottom of it, you say expands for assault, life-threatening, right?
Right.
And that was important to you. That's why you wrote it, right?
Right.
She didn't write that down there, right?
No, I wrote that.
And
once again, the hard part about this is the time where she wasn't admitting that she was the one that did all this. I'm going to skip ahead to the next part. I am going to go grab some food. Y'all might see, no, I'm going to cut that part out. I am going to go grab some food though. Pause. Okay, so that's about all of that I can take. Let's get over to the prosecution's rebuttal witness. Please don't mind me. This is my lunch break, and so I'm going to be eating in the background. This is not sponsored by the place that I'm eating. It's just I enjoy it. So, and as you're watching this rebuttal witness and the questions that she's being asked, she's going to be like, "Who would do this?" And the jury has just heard this other psychologist, Dr. Richard Samuels, that did all the things that the prosecution is going to ask.
Mr. Martinez.
may I have your name, please?
Janine DeMarty.
And what do you do for a living?
I'm a clinical psychologist.
And as part of being a clinical psychologist, where did you get your undergraduate degree?
University of Massachusetts
And when did you get that degree?
in 2002.
Going to fast forward a little bit.
Psychological evaluations, interpret test results, write reports, in addition to therapy.
So for example, in this case, did you have occasion to go visit the defendant in jail?
Yes.
And when you went to visit the defendant in jail, did somebody come with you?
Yes.
Who was that?
Dr. Celeste Corsten, at the time she had already obtained her degree, but she was in that situation that I highlighted earlier where she was not, she had not received her license yet. So she was shadowing me to learn how to do forensic evaluations.
You indicated that you also supervised those that had a master's in this field. Specifically, what did you do with regard to them?
Individuals who have a master's degree typically do not do evaluations, so I did not train them how you develop a closeness with them. Whereas in an evaluation, you're in part.
The evaluation for forensic purposes. How is treatment?
You do talk to both of them. They're very separate roles.
Well, how is treatment different than the evaluation for forensic purposes?
An important part of therapy, treatment, is that you develop a relationship with the person. You develop a closeness with them. Whereas in an evaluation, you're an independent evaluator, so is that you're not biased. If, for example, I was to be asked to provide an evaluation, an independent evaluation on any of my therapy clients that I see right now, I would not be able to do that. I have a relationship with them already.
So is there an ethical issue involving a situation where you're both a treating psychologist as well as someone who's evaluating that individual?
Absolutely, especially if you're called in as an expert witness.
So when you do this evaluation, do you go in, for example, and say to yourself, well, this is the person I've been contacted, and so I think that this person has, let's just pick something out of the air as a diagnosis, PTSD. So assuming that's what you think, do you then go about, as part of that evaluation, looking for items that confirm that diagnosis of PTSD, if that is your hypothesis?
No, it's not a good idea to go in with a hypothesis, because if you do that, then you're leaving out all the other possibilities. And that's our job as clinical psychologists, to be able to see, identify a broad array of symptoms so as to take that into consideration.
So what's the approach that is supposed to be taken with regard to an evaluation?
Well, typically in an evaluation, forensic evaluation, we receive records first. It's not always the comprehensive amount of records that we end up receiving, but we get some records first.
And what is it that you do with the records? What happens? So you get records, and what happens?
read the records, review them, and certainly from those records, there can be indicators in there that there are certain diagnoses that may be present versus others.
As part of those records that you get, when you read these records, I heard what your education was, but as part of that education, as a psychologist, does a psychologist have a special power, if you will, to go behind, for example, the words that are written down and say, well, if a person says up, they really mean down? Is that something that you are taught when you attend school?
No, if I understand your question correctly, what we do is we use those records as objective data. You take it at face value for what it says, and then you integrate it down the road into something meaningful.
When you say you take those records as objective data, what are you saying about the records that you are calling objective data?
What I mean by that is if I look at it and then I give it to somebody else, that they'll read and see the exact same thing. It's objective.
So for example, if it has the word to, T-O-O, are you saying then that somebody else could then, who can read, can then take that same document, for example, and read the word T-O-O-O, T-O-O, correct? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
So for example, if we take a look at one exhibit here, it's 456. Have you read this before?
Yes.
We have here something that says, I haven't written because there has been nothing noteworthy to report. A psychologist, do they have the, I don't know, ability to somehow look at that and say, for example, I haven't written, it says, I haven't written because there has been nothing noteworthy to report. Do you have the ability to say, I haven't written because there has been something noteworthy to report? Is that the kind of thing that you do when you read reports in anticipation of this evaluation?
I read it for face value. I read it for what it says.
So objectively, what does that first sentence say?
I haven't written because there's been nothing noteworthy to report.
Do you go behind the words and say, well, this person said there hasn't been anything noteworthy to report, so I'm going to go behind the word and say, yes, there has been something noteworthy to report just because I'm a psychologist?
No, that's just one piece of objective data that would be later integrated.
So, but do you have the ability to go back and say, you know, I'm going to change this word here, nothing, to something else just because you're a psychologist?
No.
Is there anything in the schooling of a psychologist that allows you to take a look at an objective word, or a word that's printed out? Is there a course, or is there anything out there that allows a psychologist to say, well, they wrote that, but the word nothing doesn't mean nothing? Is there anything out there that allows you to do that?
No.
How about the people that have worked for you, somebody who has a master's and is a psychotherapist? So as part of this evaluation process, you've now read what this individual has written. What is the next step that is taken with regard to a forensic evaluation?
I then schedule to go see the individual.
And is there, for example, a mandate, for example, that you are to see this individual, I don't know, over 40 hours? Is there such a requirement, for example, that you see somebody that many hours?
No.
And in fact, do you consider 40 hours to be average, below average, or above that?
It's extreme. Extreme.
When you say it's extreme, what does that mean?
I've never heard of someone spending so much time. Are you speaking about a full evaluation?
Somebody
or
sitting and talking to the defendant for 44 hours as part of a clinical interview.
as just a clinical interview?
Correct.
That makes it even more extreme.
Why is that?
Well, in clinical practice, just generally in evaluations, first of all, we're not afforded the opportunity to spend that much time. Typical clinical interviews, if we're talking about just regular evaluations, range anywhere from an hour to maybe 3 or 4 hours. In forensic evaluations, it certainly is more time because usually we do have access to more records. They tend to be a little bit more complicated. So clinical interviewing certainly can last longer.
And so with the 44 hours, Is there a danger associated with spending that much time with an individual talking?
The first thing that I think of when someone spends 44 hours with another individual in a clinical setting is that it becomes therapeutic, or it comes to mind maybe some of my students who weren't very good at clinical interviews yet, and they really didn't know what to look for, and so they ended up taking much more time doing it.
And you did conduct a clinical interview with the defendant, correct?
Yes.
So when you walked into this clinical interview and you sat down to talk to her, when did you apologize to her?
I didn't apologize to her.
Why not? Why wouldn't you apologize? You read her journals, didn't you?
I did.
So as part of a forensic interview, do you see anything problematic with apologizing to the person that you are going to interview?
Objection, speculation, and knowledge.
Overall.
I don't see the need to apologize to anybody. That seems odd.
Why does it seem odd to come in and apologize to somebody
Apologize for what?
for whatever it is that you had to speak to them? Is that something that you would do?
Objection, speculation.
Overall.
It would certainly give the impression that that person feels bad for them or has a relationship outside of that independent evaluator. It's odd. I don't know of people who go in and apologize. It doesn't make sense to me.
And I think what happened is the other evaluator went in and said, like, I'm sorry, we have to do that. I don't like, I could see someone kind of saying something like that in a forensic setting. I don't think you should, but
If an individual, if you, for example, were to go in and apologize and you said that you feel bad, if you felt bad walking into the interview, do you think that that's a problem in terms of your objective conduct of this interview?
Yes, and I think that's primarily why, or one of the reasons why some psychologists choose to not be evaluators, because they have a difficult time taking an objective approach and not feeling compassion towards a person, being able to go in there and be an objective evaluator.
So with regard to this issue of compassion, is that something, again, being compassionate during these forensic evaluations, is that something that is taught, for example, at Michigan State University? Is there a course that says when you go in, you need to be compassionate with these people that you are evaluating forensically?
No, you shouldn't feel that compassion. You should go in there as an independent.
And again, why wouldn't you feel this compassion toward this individual?
It would just bias your results.
Pardon?
It would bias your results and make you sway more in finding things that might be more helpful for them. If you feel bad for them, you want to help them.
And is that problematic if you are just there to evaluate them and provide an opinion involving a diagnosis?
Yes, because the results are not going to be accurate.
Well, as part of your evaluation with the defendant, how many hours did you devote to the clinical interview in this case?
The clinical interview was roughly 12 hours, which is a lot, which is high for a clinical interview.
Did that clinical interview that you're talking about, did that include the administration of any forensic tests?
Not in those 12 hours. I did additional testing on top of that.
So for example, for the 12 hours that you spoke with her, with the defendant, there was not any, the testing was separate and apart from those 12 hours, right?
That's correct.
And once you were done with those 12 hours and the testing was done, did you then have occasion to, let's say, 10 months later, go back to see the defendant?
I did not.
Well, why wouldn't you go back to see the defendant after you are done with your evaluation?
Objection, Judge, improper.
throughout all of the sidebars, Jodi is just over there writing or drawing or doing something, and she's just calm. Yeah.
You may continue.
Then, after you conducted this forensic interview and you were done with the forensic interview, is there any need, after you're done with an interview as a forensic examiner and conducting an evaluation, is there a need to go back and then speak with the person that you have just evaluated?
If I was uncertain about my opinion, if I had received new data that suggested something different than what I had already concluded after I had conducted my testing and clinical interviewing, then I would potentially go back.
But aside from that, is there a need to go back if there's no new data or you were uncertain about your opinion? And if you were certain about your opinion?
Not for any ethical reasons that I can think of.
And so with regard to this evaluation, and when you're conducting this evaluation, do you ever bring gifts to the person or do you ever provide gifts to the person that you are evaluating?
No, that's inappropriate.
Why is it inappropriate to provide a gift to somebody you are evaluating?
That's creating what's called a multiple relationship. It's what we talked about a little bit earlier about the difference between what is a therapist and what is an evaluator. As an evaluator, you want to be an independent person that's not influencing the individual in any kind of way.
In this case, one of the things that we've heard, and have you been provided with Richard Samuels' notes in this case?
Yes.
And after having been provided with those notes, it indicates that he made a gift of a book called The Erroneous Zones to the defendant.
Objection as to the wording, there was never a gift mentioned. That's the state's motion.
Sustained.
With regard to this book, it was provided by Mr. Samuels to the defendant, The Erroneous Zones. Are you familiar with the book, The Erroneous Zones?
I'm not familiar with that.
So if you are evaluating somebody, have you ever, in your experience, ever provided, for example, a book to somebody?
No.
And have you ever provided a book that may be a self-help book as part of this evaluation?
No, aside from it being creating a multiple relationship, I would be concerned about how that book might influence their response to any of my testing or how they responded to the clinical interview.
And what do you mean how they would respond? Exactly what are you talking about?
They may learn new information in there that they could use to then give the false pretense that they have whatever it says in the book, or it could teach them something that they didn't know before. The whole point of an evaluation is to evaluate the person for who they are.
And when you say that as part of this evaluation, you spent how many hours in the clinical interview, the speaking portion?
Roughly 12.
And what was the purpose? What is the purpose of the clinical interview? As, for example, in this case?
The clinical interview affords me the opportunity to learn about Ms. Arias. It gave me the opportunity to ask her about, for example, her medical history, her social history, her ability to connect with other people, her educational history, also her psychological history, what her symptoms looked like when she was a child versus adult. I covered a broad array of areas that are typically covered in a clinical interview.
And did you also cover, for example, in this particular case, what her sexual experiences may have been?
Yes.
And did you also cover other areas of her relationship with Mr. Alexander?
Yes.
Part of this interview. Then you also said that you conducted some testing, correct?
Correct.
What's the purpose of conducting testing?
I'm going to skip ahead to the results. I thought her results were pretty interesting and her findings.
No, it was not.
So did you go out and get or obtain a copy of the test itself so that you could compare it then to what was on the bubble sheet?
Yes, I did.
And when you did that, what is it that you found with regard to the question that talks about the triggering mechanism for PTSD?
I found that she indicated that it was an event that occurred with a stranger.
And if in this case it's been determined that the event that we're talking about did not involve a stranger, it actually involved Mr. Alexander, if that were the case, what would that do to the validity of all of the answers that followed?
It would invalidate it. Can I explain why?
Sure.
PTSD is one of those disorders, one of the only disorders that we have as psychologists that we can directly link back the etiology, meaning where did this come from? It's a specific trauma. And the PDS actually does a good job because it asks for the exact trauma to be identified up front. And the symptoms that are then filled out are associated with that trauma. So for example, I have nightmares about that trauma. I have intrusive thoughts about that specific trauma. Again, there's a direct link. So in this situation, if the original item was, you said it was related to, was found what?
Well, let's say the answer that you looked at involved what? What was the trigger event on the PDS that you had?
That it was by an individual that was a stranger.
What if it turned out that that was an absolute untruth? That it wasn't a stranger, it was somebody that she actually knew. You indicated that that would invalidate the rest of the test, right?
It would absolutely invalidate the test.
Well, what about the position that, for example, that says, well, she still suffered trauma. It's just that maybe it was a white lie that she told about what the triggering event was. If it was just a white lie and all of this other stuff here refers to the white lie, does that somehow validate this test?
It does not, again, because PTSD is strongly tied to what the actual trauma is.
So in terms of this PDS, if the trauma was not related to a stranger, in terms of the opinion in this case, is it worth anything?
No, other than it's other evidence that Ms. Arias decided to lie on a test.
Objection, Judge. May we approach?
I have to play that part back. I have to play that part back. We need to hear that one again.
If the trauma was not related to a stranger, in terms of the opinion in this case, is it worth anything?
No, other than it's other evidence that Ms. Arias decided to lie on a test.
Objection, Judge.
Wow. And it's accurate. And so we are going to skip ahead just a little bit because they're going to go back and forth about that.
And so you administered it. Are you familiar with the term IQ?
Yes, it's the same as intelligence.
And so this is an IQ test?
That is correct.
And this IQ test, is it just one straight IQ, or is it divided into 4 subparts? Or explain to me about this.
Sure.
I'm going to fast forward.
And with regard to this short-term memory test, what result did you get?
She performed well on it.
Was there ever an indication there that somehow she had any problems such that her memory was affected?
No.
How about the last one?
The last domain is called processing speed. Essentially what that tells us is how fast someone can think.
So what was her overall score or IQ score?
She scored relatively high in the above average range.
And what was that score? Do you know?
May I reference my records?
Sure. Just give it to me, however. And did she achieve a score on any of these 4 domains that was in the very superior range?
Yes, and the first domain that I described was the verbal comprehension.
And what did she score there?
I believe it's 136.
That's very high.
Take a look at it. Okay. And when you say that's very superior, what does that mean?
Objection, not rebuttal.
What does that mean?
It's the highest possible that you can get in terms of descriptor domains. So it's very high.
Did you also administer another test?
Yes,
What was that?
what's called the MMPI,
And what does that stand for?
the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory.
So the other psychologist gave the MCMI, I want to say, and she gave the MMPI. And the MMPI or the PAI are more commonly used in forensic settings, from my understanding. Let's keep going because we got to get to that diagnosis.
And
Overall, it's a measure of general psychopathology, so the presence of mental illness and general personality characteristics.
is that normed against the general population, or is that normed against those that have mental health issues and may be in a facility.
The normative population is an average typical group.
So, and you say that it's personality. What is it that, when you say personality, what is it that it's looking at?
Well, personality is characteristics that we all have within us, and it's how we relate to people. It's how we relate to the world. It's carried within us at all times. It's who we are. It's what makes us up as people.
So with regard to personality, for example, if the prosecutor, let's just assume somebody's a jerk, for lack of a better term, is that personality? Is that, there's such a thing as being a jerk?
And not using that verbiage.
Somebody can be a jerk, but like that's not a personality disorder. Gonna fast forward through this part.
All right, I'll look at this. We were talking about MMPI. Let's talk about the MMPI. One of the things that we were talking about was personality in terms of the MMPI, correct?
That's correct.
And in terms of a personality, and I started to say jerk. Do you remember that?
Yes.
With regard to personality, when does an individual, and you said that jerk isn't exactly what you mean. What is it exactly that you mean with regard to a personality?
I was just saying that that's not a terminology that I would use.
Okay, what would be the terminology that you would use?
A potential personality trait would be aggressiveness.
All right, so if you have let's say aggressiveness, would manipulation or being manipulated, is that a character trait?
Yes.
So let's say that, for example, when does this personality trait start for an individual? Does it start when they're 30? Does it start when they're 15? When do these personality traits start?
Personality is developed throughout life. It's thought to develop relatively early as a child, and it's referred to as temperament, then develops into personality. So we could see it at a very, very young age.
When you say very, very young age, what do the studies show is a very, very young age?
Starting from toddler years, that's the beginnings of it, and continues to develop throughout childhood, adolescence, and becomes much more firm in adulthood.
How is that?
That's why I personally wait until 18 and up to diagnose personality disorders, because in those younger years, a lot of that is based on attachment and environment and a lot of other things. And so,
Different from, let's say, somebody who is in a situation that is not such a good situation, and they're depressed because of that situation. Is that the same thing as a characteristic?
No, that would be much more situational. And I would determine the difference between that by looking at patterns of behavior.
So are you familiar with the terms axis 1 and axis 2?
Yes.
What is axis 1?
There's a diagnostic system that's used in the diagnostical and statistical.
and I believe the DSM-5 got rid of the axis system, and they did personality in more of a it's different than the DSM-5. It's different, but
Manual, so essentially what we use to make diagnoses. Axis 1 disorders are thought to be much more transient disorders. They're called clinical disorders. That's not necessarily the case for everything that falls under Axis 1, but it differentiates from Axis 2 in that Axis 2 captures what are called personality disorders, in addition to other spectrums that tend to be more long-lasting, like mental retardation.
So for example, if somebody is in jail and they manifest a certain profile, is that an Axis 1 profile or an Axis 2 profile?
What profile are you referring to?
Well, let's talk about somebody who, let's say, is depressed and they're in jail. Is that a characteristic, or is that just a mood that may pass?
We're talking about personality. If there's no indication that there was any kind of depression in the past, then I would label it as non-personality.
And so the MMPI that we were talking about, it measures the personality, correct?
Right.
And how is that important in making an assessment in a forensic setting?
Because it gives me the opportunity to look at personality features that may be present in the individual in terms of in a maladaptive way.
When you say in a maladaptive way, what does that mean?
So as a psychologist, when I diagnose someone with a personality disorder, what it means is that the personality trait has essentially become maladaptive. It's not helpful to them. It causes either distress with them or the people around them, or cause some sort of impairment in their life as a result of it.
And how many questions are involved in this MMPI?
There's a lot. There's 567.
And this administration of the test, explain to us how it is that you administer this test and whether or not there is a bubble sheet that's associated with
No,
this.
I'm gonna fast forward.
Are there what are called validity scales as part of this MMPI?
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why it's used so often in forensic settings. What a validity scale does is it tells us what the test taker's approach is, meaning that it tells us whether they're exaggerating their symptoms or whether they're downplaying their symptoms, whether they're defensive. It can even tell us whether they were confused on the test, intended to answer it in an inconsistent manner. So this allows us to either rely on the test results or not rely on it.
And in terms of these scales or sections, how many validity scales or sections are there?
There's roughly 9.
And with regard to the defendant, those 9 validity scales, what did they indicate?
It indicated that I was able to use the results of the test.
And what about the other scales? What is it that you're looking at with regard to the other scales or the other columns or whatever's involved?
Well, there's a number of different scales. There's a group of scales that are called the clinical scales, which are the primary areas that I looked at. I looked at the whole test, but those are the most important.
How many scales are there that you designated or that are designated as clinical scales?
There's 10.
So, and that's the ones that you focused on, right?
I looked at all of them, but that's the one I'm discussing now, yes.
And why is that one important to you, these clinical scales, these 10 scales?
There's this term called face validity, meaning that when you look at items on a test, if it has high face validity, you're able to read it and know what you're being asked in terms of what it would relate to. So for example, I cry all the time would clearly be related to depression. It has high face validity. So with this test, it tends to have lower face validity, and the validity indicators capture the test taker's approach for those clinical scales. So it tells me again whether they are being honest or not on this test.
And these clinical scales with regard to the defendant, what did they tell you, these 10 clinical scales?
The results of her MMPI were interesting in that, again, there's 10 clinical scales. What I typically see when I administer this test is that there is 1, 2, maybe even 3, what we call elevations, meaning that their score went above 65. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that's the threshold in which we as psychologists know that it's kind of like a tap on the shoulder that tells us this means it's clinically relevant, that there's something going on in this domain.
So the cutoff or the threshold for these scales, these 10 scales that we're talking about, is the number 65, right?
That is correct.
And if it's above 65, it's something that is worth looking at again because it may indicate something. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, so go ahead. What else did you see?
So what I found is, again, there's 10 scales. What I found is that 7 of the 10 scales were above that threshold. The majority of them were above that threshold.
So 7 of the 10 were above, of the clinical scales were above the threshold, right?
That's correct.
So what does that mean to you now that you've read some of the materials, you've then had the clinical interview, you've administered these other tests, and now you're doing the MMPI, and you have this elevation on 7 of the 10 scales or areas. What did that tell you?
Because there were 7 scales that were elevated, what that means is there was a lot of data for me to look at. There was a lot of personality indicators, signs of psychopathology that were then present. So the way that that is typically handled when there are that many elevations is that I then examined the top 2 and 3 scales that were the highest. And I was able to interpret those scales into meaningful personality characteristics.
So the top 2 or 3 scales that you interpreted, what did they relate to?
The top 3 scales indicate that people with this personality profile tend to experience a lot of aggressiveness, hostility, defensiveness. But interestingly, these individuals do a relatively good job on a day-to-day basis of not displaying it to people. So this isn't someone who's walking around consistently hostile.
Like she's over there because there is something under there. Like she has a good mask. Like that's what the testing showed, that to anyone seeing her, they wouldn't notice that she's aggressive, erratic, any of those things. But if you get close enough,
Throwing things where it's visible to other people, but they're still experiencing those emotions inside. In times when they feel like they've been wronged in some sort of way, or when someone has done something to hurt them that they perceive as hurting them in any kind of way, the way that it's described in the literature is they have these violent outbursts that are described as seething, as very angry. And what they tend to do, what this profile suggests, is that these individuals tend to externalize blame. So for example, I acted out this way because that person deserved it. So they externalize it. They say, it's not my fault. I didn't act this way because I have these strong emotions inside. I act this way because someone did something to me. That's how they're able to conceptualize it and justify it in their mind.
And so in this case, the defendant's scores or on the scales indicated that, if I understood it, that she internalized the anger. Would that be fair or not?
Suggestion, speculation. This was a general scale, not specific to Ms. Arias.
All right, we're going to take the noon recess at this time. Ladies and gentlemen,
Gotta
please
fast
be
forward.
back.
she puts on such a good act. Good, in my opinion. Wow.
Of the MMPI on the clinical portion that you reviewed, correct?
Correct, the top 2 and 3.
And then you gave us, before lunch, you gave us your impression, not your impression, but your opinion about what those meant, right? Before we
Yes.
left. Are you familiar with the term floating profiles?
Yes,
And as it applies, does that have anything to do with the MMPI?
yes.
What is that?
A floating profile is when you see that there are a number of elevations, such as I described earlier on the MMPI. When the vast majority of the clinical scales are elevated, again, that threshold is 65. When it's elevated above 65, it's called a floating profile.
And why is that significant in this case as it applies to the defendant?
A floating profile is commonly seen in individuals who have borderline personality disorder.
Right. You also indicated that you administered the WACE test. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Why did you administer the WACE?
When I first started reviewing the records, there was indication in those records that there was a sense of immaturity that was present. For example, in Ms. Arias's booking profile, the way that she took the picture, she kind of smiled as though it was a high school photo rather than a booking picture that you would typically see. This to me was strange. I found it to be strange and immature.
And I'm just going to show it really quick because it was pretty strange. And so like that looks like a high school yearbook photo. I also saw another one where it almost looked like she was like enjoying herself. It was very odd. I did not follow this case back when everything happened. And I appreciate the person that asked me to take a look at this one now. Thank you again for sending me this case and asking me to take a look at the defense. I can't always do that, but this was those experts. I really enjoyed taking a look at this. We're going to keep going.
Sure. There was also the things that happened surrounding that suggested that there was, again, some immaturity there, such as her parents had indicated that she was described as being happy as hell when they came to visit her in jail. There was behaviors like this that were aberrant, that were strange, and it made me wonder whether there was some sort of intellectual deficit there that could be contributing to this, which is why I gave the intelligence test.
And you were able to determine and find what you found, what you've already told us, correct?
Correct.
As a result of that, in the testing that you did you reach a diagnosis or did you have an opinion at that point, or did you do more testing?
I conducted the 4 tests that we've already discussed.
And after that, did you have an opinion as to what the diagnosis was in this case?
After looking at that, taking in consideration her behavioral observations and all of the different pieces of information that I had, yes, I did.
And what was that?
I diagnosed her on Axis 2 as borderline personality disorder.
What does that mean?
Generally, borderline personality disorder, you can think of it similar to what we see in teenagers often. This sense of immaturity and what's called emotional lability, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But generally, it's about instability. There's unstable interpersonal relationships, unstable emotions, and an unstable sense of identity, meaning who am I as a person? There's this constant fluctuation. There's a lot of manipulation that's involved with people who have borderline personality disorder and a large sense of immaturity. You can, again, think about a teenager.
All right. Y'all know we are psych nerds here, and I love to just give education on these topics. And so I work with individuals with borderline personality disorder. Please always remember individuals who have mental health diagnoses are often more likely to be victimized by crimes or be harmful towards themselves versus being harmful towards others. Individuals with borderline personality disorder, I view it as a skills deficit through that dialectical behavior therapy or DBT lens. That's a type of therapy that was developed by Dr. Marsha Linehan. And what these individuals need is safety, security, and stability. But often there's this self-sabotage that can happen within relationships. And that in no way is to but it just kind of helps me understand just this pattern that can sometimes show up. There's often a difficulty with establishing and respecting the boundaries of others. And so that's why having really good boundaries is really, really important for individuals with that particular diagnosis. And so that's why I try to have good boundaries with all my clients, and making sure that those things are clear up front. But I've had a lot of success with working with clients that have this particular diagnosis and doing DBT skills training, working with them on any past trauma, and just helping support them in that way. Those are just some of my thoughts on this case. Let me know if y'all have any questions. And I am going to be following up with a video on Lacey Fletcher. That is a horrific case. Her parents recently had a court date, and so that video should come out on Tuesday. I'm going to change my time to Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern instead of 8 p.m. Eastern. And depending on when the videos are finished, because I'm trying to be consistent with this. And so I think we can do that. But Tuesdays and Saturdays, those are my normal video release days. And then I sometimes do shorts in between there. I now have a YouTube shorts playlist, specifically for court reactions. So I'm trying to have those playlists make it easy for you all to like and find the content that you're interested in. If you get tired of the court stuff, please know I have a ton of non-court related content. That's how my channel started, and there are a ton of resources out there. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.